Hash script. The screen in front of Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov showed 5 American ICBMs inbound to Soviet territory. Launch time, 4 minutes ago. Impact time, 18 minutes. The protocol was explicit. He was required to report the strike to Soviet High Command immediately. High Command would launch a full retaliatory strike within 6 minutes. The entire sequence from his report to global thermonuclear war, 11 minutes. Petrov did not pick up the phone. This was not heroism. This was something stranger. The system told him the world was ending. Every piece of data confirmed it. 5 missiles. High confidence reading. The satellite network had never produced a false positive at this classification level, and Petrov looked at the screen and thought, this doesn't make sense. Not morally, tactically. If the United States was launching a first strike against the Soviet Union, why 5 missiles? The American nuclear arsenal in 1983 contained 9,000 warheads. A first strike doctrine, the kind that starts a war you intend to win, requires overwhelming force. You don't knock on the door with 5 missiles. You kick it down with 500. Petrov's exact words to the officer standing next to him. When you start a war, you start a war. You don't send 5. He waited. The system continued to show 5 inbound missiles. High confidence. The countdown continued. Petrov did not report it. He told his staff they were waiting for ground radar confirmation. Ground radar saw nothing. The satellites were wrong. A rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had triggered the infrared sensors. The system interpreted reflected light as rocket exhaust. If Petrov had followed protocol, Soviet leadership would have launched within 6 minutes of his report. The United States would have detected the launch within 90 seconds. American missiles would have been in the air 4 minutes later. The exchange would have been complete within 90 minutes. Estimated deaths in the first 72 hours. 400 million. Estimated deaths in the following year from radiation and collapse of agricultural systems, 1.6 billion. Petrov prevented that by not making a phone call. He was reprimanded for it. His documentation of the incident was incomplete. He had violated protocol. He was transferred out of the command center. He never received a promotion. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, his pension collapsed with it. He lived in a small town outside Moscow, in a 2-room apartment. In 2004, a journalist found him and asked why he had waited instead of reporting. Petrov said, "I was just in the right place at the right time." That was the second time. The first time nobody knows about. 1979. Stanislav Petrov was not yet at the early warning bunker. He was stationed at a different facility, a command center responsible for coordinating air defense response over Soviet territory in Eastern Europe. The geopolitical situation was different then. The Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan. NATO was expanding missile deployment in West Germany. Both sides were interpreting every radar contact as potential prelude to war. November 9, 1979. A training tape loaded into the NORAD computer system in Colorado, part of a scheduled drill, was mistakenly processed as live data. The system showed a full-scale Soviet ICBM launch. 220 missiles inbound. NORAD went to DEFCON 2. Strategic Air Command began spinning up bomber engines. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the plane that directs nuclear war if ground command is destroyed, launched from Andrews Air Force Base. The Soviet early warning system detected all of it. Petrov's facility picked up the American bomber scramble, the command aircraft launch, the elevated radar activity. His station was responsible for determining whether this was an exercise or the beginning of an American first strike. If he reported it as a strike, Soviet leadership would have launched. And they would have launched at a United States that had no idea it had just been mistakenly identified as the aggressor. Petrov's report. Atmospheric conditions and flight profile inconsistent with first strike doctrine. Recommended classification, exercise or false alarm. He was correct. NORAD discovered the error 4 minutes later. The bombers were recalled. The command plane returned to Andrews. Nobody in the United States knew how close it had come. Nobody in the Soviet Union knew Petrov had made the call that prevented escalation. He received no commendation for that one either. It was classified. The existence of the near launch was not disclosed to Soviet leadership. If they knew the early warning system had nearly caused a retaliatory strike against a non-attacking enemy, confidence in the system would collapse. So the incident was buried in a file that was destroyed when the Soviet Union dissolved. We know about it only because one of the junior officers at Petrov's station mentioned it in a 2012 interview. He remembered Petrov's exact words. If they were coming, they would come differently. If you're counting, that's two. The third time was not Petrov. The third time was Vasily Arkhipov. October 27, 1962. You know this date if you know the Cuban Missile Crisis. You probably know the story of the 13 days, the blockade, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey. What you don't know is that the decision to not start a nuclear war was made by a single officer on a Soviet submarine who had no way to communicate with Moscow and no idea whether the war had already started. Soviet submarine B-59, Foxtrot-class diesel-electric sub, part of a group deployed to Cuba during the blockade. The US Navy detected the sub and began forcing it to surface using practice depth charges, small explosives that signal surface now, without attempting to sink the vessel. The crew of B-59 did not know they were practice depth charges. They had been submerged for days. The ventilation system was failing. Internal temperature was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching toxic. They had lost contact with Moscow. The last communication they received was that the situation was escalating. Then, silence. Then, explosions in the water around them. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, believed the war had started. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Soviet protocol required agreement from 3 officers to launch a nuclear weapon: the captain, the political officer, and the second in command. The captain agreed. The political officer agreed. The second in command was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov said no. The argument lasted hours. Savitsky: "We're being attacked. Moscow is probably already gone. Our orders are to retaliate." Arkhipov: "We do not know that the war has started. We know only that we are being asked to surface." The political officer sided with the captain, 2 against 1. Except Soviet naval regulations specified that all 3 officers must agree unanimously. One refusal was enough to block the launch. Arkhipov refused. B-59 surfaced. The crew discovered they were not under attack. The war had not started. The practice depth charges were a signal, not a weapon. If Arkhipov had agreed with the captain, the nuclear torpedo would have been fired at the USS Randolph, a nearby aircraft carrier. The explosion would have destroyed the carrier and killed 5,000 American sailors. The United States would have interpreted it as a Soviet first strike. Nuclear retaliation would have been immediate. Arkhipov prevented it by saying one word: no. He was never punished for it. He was never rewarded either. The incident remained classified until 2002. Arkhipov died in 1998. He never spoke publicly about it. His wife mentioned it once in an interview. She said he had nightmares about it for years. He would wake up and say, "I thought I heard the explosions." If you want to subscribe to this channel, now would be the time. We're covering the stories that don't make it into the textbooks. So, 3 men. 3 decisions. Petrov twice, Arkhipov once. Between them, they prevented the deaths of somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people. None of them were rewarded. One of them, Petrov, was reprimanded. Another, Arkhipov, had nightmares. The third version of Petrov in 1979 was never acknowledged. Why does this matter now? Because the systems have not improved. They have become faster. In 1983, Petrov had 4 minutes to decide. Modern early warning systems reduce that window to 90 seconds. Satellite detection of a launch is instantaneous. The decision loop, detect, verify, report, authorize response, is built for speed because the assumption is that hesitation kills you. The doctrine is, if you wait to be sure, you are already dead. Petrov's logic in 1983, this doesn't make tactical sense, requires time to think. 90 seconds is not enough time to think. It is barely enough time to confirm the data, let alone question it. The second problem, automation. In 1983, the system told Petrov the missiles were inbound, but a human had to report it up the chain. Modern systems are building in automated escalation. If the sensor detects the launch, the system alerts command authority, and the protocol activates, all within the same minute. The human discretion point, the place where Petrov said wait, is being compressed or removed. There is a term for this in military strategic theory. Use it or lose it. If your detection and response time is faster than your enemy's, you have a first strike advantage. If your detection and response time is slower, you have an incentive to launch preemptively before the enemy's faster system destroys your ability to respond. Both sides building faster systems does not make anyone safer. It makes the window for human judgment smaller. Petrov had 4 minutes to be wrong and still have time to correct it. Modern systems do not have 4 minutes. They have 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is not long enough to notice that 5 missiles do not make tactical sense. Here is the third thing you need to understand. We do not train for Petrov's. Military protocol is built around obedience to data. If the system says the missiles are inbound, you report it. You do not second-guess the system. Second-guessing the system gets people killed in every other scenario. If the radar shows an inbound fighter, you do not wait to see if the radar is wrong. You respond. The correct instinct in 99.9% of situations is, trust the data, follow the protocol. Petrov's decision was correct because he violated that instinct. He second-guessed the system. He waited. He applied tactical logic that was not part of the protocol. The problem: you cannot train someone to follow protocol in every case except the one case where following protocol ends the world. That is not a trainable skill. That is judgment, and judgment requires time. We are systematically removing the time. If you found this useful, send it to someone who still thinks technology makes us safer by default. It does not. It makes us faster. Faster is not the same as safer. Now, the why. Why did Petrov wait? Not the tactical reason, we know that. The psychological reason. What was happening in his head in those 4 minutes? He described it once in an interview. He said, "I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? If I report it and I'm wrong, I just started a war that didn't need to happen. If I don't report it and I'm wrong, my country is about to be destroyed and I did nothing." He said the second option felt worse in his body, but the first option felt worse in his head. He went with his head. That distinction matters. Felt worse in his body. That is the fear response. The adrenaline, the evolutionary system that says, threat detected, respond now, felt worse in his head. That is the prefrontal cortex. The system that says, wait, does this make sense? In a 90-second decision window, the body wins. The fear response is faster than the analytical process. You do not have time to think your way out of fear in 90 seconds. You have time only to act on it. Modern systems are built for the body's speed. They are not built for the head's caution. This is why Petrov is not replicable. You cannot train someone to override their fear response in 90 seconds while simultaneously training them to trust their fear response in every other scenario. The protocol and the judgment are in direct conflict. Petrov worked because he had 4 minutes. 4 minutes is long enough for the fear to peak and then subside, just enough for the analytical process to start. 90 seconds is not. The military knows this. There is a classification of decision-making research called high-tempo environments. The research consistently shows as decision time decreases, reliance on heuristics and protocol increases, judgment decreases. You do not get better decisions under time pressure. You get faster decisions. And faster decisions in a nuclear early warning context means more Petrovs are needed, but fewer Petrovs are possible. Arkhipov had hours. The argument on B-59 lasted long enough for the fear to cycle through and for the political officer to eventually agree with Arkhipov that they did not know enough. If that conversation had been compressed to 90 seconds, the political officer does not switch sides. The launch happens. We have built a system that requires Petroverse but does not allow time for Petroverse to happen. The fourth thing, Petroverse logic was correct, but it was not protocol. 5 missiles don't make sense is tactical reasoning. It is not part of the early warning decision tree. The decision tree is: satellites detect launch, classify confidence level. If confidence is high, report immediately. There is no step that says evaluate whether the number of missiles makes strategic sense. That step does not exist because adding it slows down the process. And slowness in the logic of nuclear deterrence, kills you. But Petrov added that step anyway. He invented a new decision rule in the moment, and the reason he could invent it is that he had been trained not just in protocol, but in strategy. He understood why the protocol existed. He understood what a first strike was supposed to look like. And because he understood the why, he could recognize when the data did not match the why. Modern training is more specialized. You are trained to operate the system, not to understand the strategy behind the system. That is more efficient. It is also more fragile. If the system produces data,